All right, Sherry, I think we have just about a quorum of our participants. Feel free to go ahead and start.
Thanks, Katie. Warm greetings from snowy Arlington, Virginia. My name is Sherry Mueller, and it's my privilege to serve as the president of the Public Diplomacy Council. It's also my privilege to welcome each of you to this webinar, this first Monday forum featuring John Dickson, the author of History Shock. There are 3 co-sponsors to these first Monday forums, the Public Diplomacy Association of America, the University of Southern California Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy, and the Public Diplomacy Council. All of us hope you've enjoyed a meaningful holiday season with moments of serenity, and all of us wish you a happy and healthy new year. A wonderful way to mark the new year is to read New Day's Lyric by the young poet Amanda Gorman. One of the lines is particularly appropriate to our program today. She wrote, "For when you honor yesterday, tomorrow ye will find." So to help us explore history, we have our primary tech host, Katie Conti. She's a rising professional member of the Public Diplomacy Council, also a graduate student at the London School of Economics. Also, our backup tech host is the Hans Tom Tuck PDC graduate fellow, Marcy Falk-Bedos. I want to thank both of them. And also, they asked me to remind you for questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and also with your name and affiliation. So Katie, as she moderates, can ascribe the question to a particular questioner. And also, if you have any technical difficulties, please alert them to that in the chat box so they can be addressed. It's now my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Professor Dan Whitman. Dan has served as a member of the Public Diplomacy Council Board. He's a veteran of USIA and our State Department. He told me he had his very first public diplomacy contract assignment in 1969. I've often seen him in the halls of the School of International Service at American University when he was assistant professor there, and he currently teaches at George Washington University. Dan, thanks for being part of our program today. Most importantly, you know and have worked with John Dickson. And thank you for all you've done for the field of public diplomacy. I turn the microphone over to Professor Dan Whitman.
Hello, and thanks, Sherry, and thanks, John, and thanks, Joel and Katie. I've been given 3 minutes, so I'm going to set my egg timer to make sure I don't go over. This is a great thrill for me personally. Guys, this is a great book. This may be reversed in your image. This is a great book. It's a delight to read. And as we were saying a little bit before the program, I think it should be required of everybody going through the FSI experience. I love this book, and I would like to suggest that it creates a new genre, actually, because in it, John includes a mixture of personal anecdote, rigorous scholarship, and mindfulness about how best to do diplomacy. He's very open about the pitfalls of failing to know history. And he quotes Gore Vidal as saying of the United States, we are the United States of amnesia. In that, there's an implied question that John may want to talk about. He and I have exchanged some views about why is it that America, with its strengths and weaknesses, seems to have a consistent weakness in the area of history. I mean, I have some theories of that, and maybe John does too. John's bio, in his own version of that, on page 5 of his book, he reminds us he was a social studies teacher, and then he became involved in overseas activities in a summer camp in New Brunswick, Canada, a beautiful province. I've driven through New Brunswick. Then Peace Corps, 3 years teaching in Gabon. And then when he went into the Foreign Service, he went straight to Lagos and to South Africa. I think it was Pretoria, maybe Cape Town. And I've served both in South Africa and in Nigeria. John was enormously helpful to me in 1994-95. He got me introduced to this concept of something called, remember, John, the Dire Emergency Fund? Sounds like something that happens after an earthquake, but in fact, it was the name the US government gave to these quick turnaround exchange programs that were arranged because of the advent of majority rule in South Africa. Wonder why they called it emergency, but the idea was, got to do something quick. And John was extremely helpful as the Southern Africa desk officer in USIA at that time. I call John Mr. NAFTA because he has been DCM in every North American country except one, and that would be the United States. We don't yet have an embassy in the United States. Again, I believe this is a new genre, just quoting from John on page 8. This book is, on the one hand, a personal memoir of isolated, seemingly unconnected incidents during my 26-year career as Foreign Service officer. Personal experience becomes the vehicle to shed light on the intersection of national memory and history with foreign relations. The personal memoir taps into and alternates the historic analysis that helps explain the personal experience. That sounds like a mouthful. In fact, the delight of this book is it really merges the personal and the contextual side. And in every chapter ends with a reading list in case you want to look further into these areas. This book is a call to action. And I really want to stress that. There's a clear lesson here. If you don't know a nation's history, and if you try to do diplomacy in that nation, you will not succeed. This has been proven over and over again. We know this is true, but John puts his finger on this and shows us that while we kind of discard history and we give it short shrift at FSI, he's quite right about that. Those area studies, they try, but they don't really do much. And without this context, we're going to fail as diplomats. History, if the reason we need history, events just keep going and going, and there's nothing. It's like journalism. If the airplane takes off, there's no story. But when there's a disruption, when something bad happens, that's what we call history. And history, that's why history is mainly a sad and tragic story, almost, I would say 90% of the time. And we need, so the history that we read is mainly, these are mainly bad stories. And if we don't know them, we're ignoring the sensitivities of the friends and colleagues we have in other countries. I hope everybody's reading Heather Cox Richardson every night. She writes a nightly blog. She teaches history at Boston College. Last week, when she was discussing the history of the Battle of Wounded Knee, which was not really a battle, it was a massacre. Here's what she said. One of the curses of history is that we cannot go back and change the course leading to disasters, no matter how much we might wish to. The past has its own terrible inevitability, but it's never too late to change the future. In this book, John gives us a lot of mea culpas. I didn't know this, I didn't know that. No, John, I reject your mea culpas. You, on the contrary, you are one who recognizing the need, I won't say the faults or the lacunae, recognizing the needs, you have met them. And again, this book is a call to action. Without history, don't bother trying to do diplomacy. It won't work. And finally, on the subject of decency, John's decency shows through. I don't know if John even is aware of this. This book shows us a decent person. Again, could FSI ever teach decency? They try. They try. I don't think they do very well. Either you've got it or you don't. John, you've got it. You have decency. And with this, I hand it over to you. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And I am in awe of your achievement here. Thanks, everybody.
Wow, Dan, I don't know if people watched and saw my head swell up visibly on the screen with that introduction.
Well deserved.
Taking a look at the list of participants, there's a lot of people who are decent former colleagues and who are also high on the emotional intelligence of decency, who I've worked with over the years. I want to thank Sherry for the invitation and thank the Public Diplomacy Council right off. I really appreciate all you do as a council to support public diplomacy. We've all experienced in our careers that public diplomacy is too much of an afterthought in the conduct of our foreign relations. It's important that organizations like this keep it closer to the foreground. What I thought I'd do is start off talking a little bit about the book and how I came to pull it together, and then get into the topic about implications for public diplomacy. I did have a couple of caveats at the start. Dan beat me to it. One is I'm aware that in the book and beyond, I opened myself up to a critique about not knowing. Why didn't I know more history? I have given a number of these talks. People outside the profession have historians and lay non-historians. They're express. They're both amazed and even in polite terms a little appalled that the U.S. would send out to embassies overseas our people who are so ill-versed in history. The second caveat is I don't pretend that this is the most important aspect of our relations with foreign countries. My book recounts minor episodes, but there's a list of experiences of historical illiteracy or competing histories that have haunted the US in major ways. And here I think most prominently of Iran and the ignorance and unwillingness to acknowledge our involvement in the coup in 1954. Even today, in today's headlines, we read Vladimir Putin is drawing on out of context statements from Secretary of State James Baker to justify his threatened invasion of Ukraine. And we all remember the war in the former Yugoslavia, that where people remembered history and were fighting over things that happened in the 1300s. My book was a bit of a personal exploration, how in my daily life as a Foreign Service officer, I encountered occasions where history really intruded. In some cases, history got in the way of any effort to achieve cooperation on issues of concern. In other cases, I found not knowing the history, or I found knowing the history actually played a constructive role. And it's not all negative, and so I do have some positive examples. But in more cases, I confess to not knowing the history at all. I started writing the book in 2013, but I had been unsettled by this gap between history and foreign affairs for years before. I'd say that this confusion in history, as Dan said, isn't really confined to foreign affairs. We're in the middle right now of a national discussion about history, our history, about communities within our borders that have been ignored, overlooked. He mentioned one already, the history of Native Americans, African Americans, women. You know, do we deny this history? Do we emphasize it? What's a proper balance? Is this a discussion worth having at all? I think it is. And I think as this is one way out of the history of amnesia, we really need to review this. And I have another question that I raise in the book, and coming out of it is should we as a nation also be unearthing the role of the US overseas with all its warts and shortcomings? Is it feasible, and could it be helpful? So you'll all know the title of the book, History Shock, is a bit of a gimmick related to culture shock. It grew out of an assignment for a course I took after retirement at UMass Amherst. The term described my reaction of surprise to experiences I had in my interactions with foreign counterparts. I saw they were operating from a different, what I call, competing version of history. Now, we all know culture shock, that sensation when we find ourselves in a foreign country and don't understand what's going on. I was prepared for culture shock. Dan mentioned Canada, my experience in Canada, my experience in the Peace Corps. I was not prepared for history shock in my overseas assignments. Now, this can be argued, but I would say nowhere does history play as prominent a role in our foreign relations as it does in Mexico. People on the call may have other ideas. I hadn't been in Mexico, but 3 weeks really before I realized that for Mexicans, their relationships to the United States revolves around 1848 and the loss of half their territory in that war. I saw it daily in the headlines and my interactions with people. And I quote the writer Carlos Fuentes from his book, El Gringo Viejo. He says, "Memory and resentment go hand in hand." I used to say Mexicans wake up in the morning, they look in the mirror and they see history. Not me. And I, among many other people, preferred to forget our history in that time. In my research, I found a survey that was undertaken by an organization called the Lincoln in Mexico Project in San Diego in 2014. They decided this project to map out the original border of Mexico. And they went along the way and did a survey. They said, and I quote, they encountered only a few people who barely seemed to grasp that Mexico once encompassed all of present-day Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Texas, more than half of Colorado, smaller portions of Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. I began to notice little incidents, daily occurrences, not the grand stuff of diplomacy, but small encounters where the Mexican view of their history with the US got in the way or obstructed cooperation. And I described them in the book. Secretary Albright's visit to the archaeological site Monte Alban, just a visit that turned into headlines of the Americans taking over our heritage. The funeral of a Mexican soldier during the Iraq War, and the launching of the Northern Command, where the Mexicans thought what we were doing was taking over their responsibility, their military. All of these and more were connected to not only a competing history, but also dependent on my not knowing history as well. So what was going on? And so I set out to explore this connection. I decided to get a graduate history degree at UMass Amherst to really explore this. And as I did, I began to notice this pattern from Mexico was repeated in my other assignments. I called other incidents where history played a role in South Africa. Dan, I was in Durban, in Canada, in Peru, in Haiti, and Cuba. And then later when I was in WHA in Washington, further with other countries in the hemisphere. And one recurring question kept coming up: how come I didn't know this before? Why wasn't I aware that the US, for example, had occupied Haiti for 19 years beginning in 1915, that atrocities had occurred, that they had been investigated by the US Congress, that we had resorted in Haiti to the French system of forced labor, what's called the corvée, in a country that was proud and alone in the world in its success of rebelling against slavery. In the 1900s, we returned to that. I did not know that up to 11,000 people may have died during guerrilla fighting over those 19 years of occupation. And likewise, there are other histories that I talk about in the book. For example, the burning of the city of York, Toronto, by the Americans in the War of 1812, long before the British burned Washington, D.C. I've never heard of that. I never saw it in any text as a teacher. Well, I didn't know of Teddy Roosevelt's blatant grab of Panama, manufacturing a revolt against Colombia to send in American forces, restore order, set up an independent country, and then we could build a canal across the isthmus. This manufacturing of revolt was a maneuver repeated in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, and Iran, attempted at the Bay of Pigs. I should have known what the Platt Amendment was, how it played out in Cuba and the rest of the hemisphere, but my knowledge of the Spanish-American War was really limited to Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. The Platt Amendment became shorthand across in Cuba and elsewhere. This was an amendment passed after the war that gave the US the right to intervene in Cuba, exercise control over Cuba's foreign and military policies. Castro used this Platt Amendment railing on his way to power and in the 50 years afterwards, as well as other places. In Nigeria, I never knew that Malcolm X had been there, and he was famous for talking about and warning Nigerians to be concerned about American diplomats trying to sugarcoat race relations in the US. And so when we did just that in the 1980s, the Nigerians remembered, but we did not know of this. I did not know, for example, that race relations was a major issue in the Cold War in the 1950s, and even was one of the justifications for the passage of one of the first civil rights acts, was that we were getting hammered overseas because of the problem of race relations at home. So I began to lump all these incidents, what I called under the rubric of history shock. And history shock occurs when a surprise, and the question of history shock is, why didn't I know that? So I had some conclusions about why I didn't know this as much as I should have, even though I studied history at universities, taught it in schools, passed a Foreign Service exam that emphasized knowledge of US history. And I think this gets to what Dan was talking about, Gore Vidal. Ours is a culture that really looks forward. We don't look back. I think we're a society that's built a narrative, for example, that we're an exceptional country, an indispensable nation. And we tend to overlook those things that don't correspond to that narrative. And then there are factors that are related more to the profession. We're a foreign service that moves people around every couple of years. Very rarely do diplomats go back. We don't want our diplomats developing clientitis. But in the process, it really means they don't develop a truly in-depth understanding. I was fortunate to have spent 7 years working on South Africa and 6 years on Mexico. That's unusual, I think. Even though I'd only had one assignment, I extended and worked on them in Washington as well. And I do think there's insufficient formal training, leaving the process of learning really at the discretion of individual officers. And I think there's a decline in the study of history and general historical awareness. As Dan mentioned, I think history departments around American universities now are getting thinner and thinner. And even, some of the debates about history in texts and schools around the country. So what are the implications for public diplomacy? I have four. The first is really the importance of acknowledging history, and history that matters, acknowledging the competing history of our foreign counterparts, and even extending all the way to the issue of apology. I raise the issue of apology in my book in a chapter on wreath laying. And I draw from a historian named Jennifer Lind who wrote a book called Sorry States. And she chronicles statements and actions of Germany and Japan in the years following World War II. As early as 1951, Germany started paying reparations. In 1970, in a very famous public gesture, German Chancellor Willy Brandt fell to his knees at a memorial to the thousands of Jews who lost their lives in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this spontaneous gesture became a symbol of German atonement for Nazi crimes. Lynn goes on to conclude that failure to acknowledge past aggression and atrocities can fuel distrust and elevate threat perception. She also acknowledges that there's a backlash, a political backlash for leaders who take steps to atone or apologize. And we know this. Mitt Romney wrote his campaign book in 2012 was called No Apology. He painted Obama, he tried to paint Obama as the apology president who would go on apology tours. He echoed George H.W. Bush, who said in his campaign, "I will never apologize for the United States." He said that following the shootdown of the accidental shootdown of the Iranian civilian airliner in the Persian Gulf in 1988. But the fact of the matter, there are instances of American apology. Open, direct apologies, whether it is Japanese internment or the takeover of Hawaii in the late 1800s. Warren Christopher apologized for State Department inaction on the El Mozote atrocity in El Salvador during their civil war. We've seen it in other countries. British have apologized and paid reparations for their role of torture in the Mau Mau rebellions. Canada has paid reparations for First Nations boarding schools. But apology isn't the only response to acknowledge the history. I would say remembering is one response as well. Recognizing, acknowledging our past behavior, I think, is on a continuum of atonement. And the sociologist Irving Goffman wrote about this continuum. It starts out with acknowledging, disavowing, repenting, and offering restitution. When Obama went to Hiroshima in 2016, there was a widely publicized debate in advance of whether Obama would apologize. He didn't. He laid a wreath, made simple comments about eliminating nuclear weapons in the future. It was a simple gesture, not an apology, but a recognition of that terrible, difficult devastation that happened years earlier. Japanese Prime Minister Abe came to Pearl Harbor and afterwards, and he likewise laid a wreath. But Obama wasn't the first to do that. In 1947, Harry Truman went to Mexico City. On the 100th anniversary of the war, the Mexicans asked him not to come in 1948. On the centennial of that, it would be too close, too prominent. So Truman said, "Okay, I'm coming now." And so he came in 1947, and spontaneously, he accepted a last-minute decision by the US ambassador there to lay a wreath at the memorial for the Niños Héroes. These were the child soldiers who threw themselves off the walls of Chapultepec Castle rather than surrender to the Americans. Truman didn't apologize, but it was a dramatic gesture that had its intended effect. Truman laid a wreath. It was seen as a spontaneous act. It generated enormous positive reaction. And it helped Truman convince Mexico to overcome its reluctance to sign on and join the Organization of American States, which they did within a few months. As Jennifer Lynn said, it helped the relationship move forward. Now, I never knew about that. I served in Mexico for 5 years. I never knew Truman had done that. Just an example of not knowing. But what he did was acknowledge what was important to Mexico and its own view of that, of its history. Our memory of the war is limited, mostly confined to the Alamo, which happened years before the war started, maybe the Marine hymn from the halls of Montezuma. But Truman's gesture was an easy one, a simple one. Now, another way to use history in public diplomacy is to do what I would call, just mimic what one ambassador said. He wanted to fill up the reservoir of goodwill. And so there are a few examples in the book I talk about of filling up the reservoir, using history to help fill up the reservoir. One happened to be the cultural property agreement we had with Peru to return stolen artifacts to the country. Peru was one of the first, but now we now have many agreements. These are wonderful agreements. When the U.S. Customs and Border agents find an item that is on a list of prohibited entry imports, they confiscate it. And what happened in Peru was we would, every few months, we would have our ambassador go out and make a big ceremony presentation of these returned items. Now, our ambassador in Peru at the time couldn't go out in public and not talk about the Peruvian government of Fujimori, his record on human rights. And he would, every occasion, after doing this, the press would corner him and they would want some comment on the latest thing that Fujimori is trying to do to limit democracy. But the fact that he had returned these items was a nod to what Peru's identity is so wrapped up in their pre-colonial archaeology, that this was a way of the United States showing respect for Peru in its long history, at the same time that he would have these statements that were very controversial, that were critical of Fujimori's human rights record. The second example I have in the book is of a project by the Smithsonian to go down to Haiti after the earthquake and start a project to protect their art, their murals that had been devastated, their archives that had been destroyed. And embassy didn't want the Smithsonian there. They resisted, and the Smithsonian said, no, we don't need country clearance, we're coming down. And what the Smithsonian did was they made the analogy, and it was a very apt analogy. It was, what would happen if there was a similar event in Washington, D.C. that destroyed our national archives or some of the museums there? This would, or as we saw, there was a very small earthquake that damaged the Washington Monument. These are our national monuments. These are very closely aligned to the national psyche. And this is what the Smithsonian saw was important, not only as others were working on the recovery and relief efforts, this was part of that. And I think it helped just as much as Dolly Madison saving the portrait of Washington in the War of 1812. Another way I think for public diplomacy is what I would call a history fact check, or pause. And I use the word pause, which is not my word. It has to do with, again, it comes from two Harvard political scientists, Ernest May and Richard Neustadt, in a book called Thinking in Time, where they explore the role history could play in government decision-making. And what they say and what they suggest is it's important to have a pause in any major decision, just a history fact check, a check to look at what there might be in terms of historical analogies. Now, I was fortunate in my last assignment to work with a PhD in history. His name was Peter Sampson. He knew Latin America like nobody else, and he had gotten his doctorate, I think, in Latin American history. And he proposed a wreath laying at the statue of Jose San Martin right outside the department on the bicentennial of Argentina's independence. He wrote the memos that never got out. Nobody accepted it or cleared it at the time, but he then went ahead and prepared programs to recognize and acknowledge what was important to Argentina during their bicentennial. And it wasn't just Argentina, there were 4 countries that had their bicentennial in 2010. But Peter also sounded the alarms when he learned that the Southcom, the Southern Command, had decided to reorganize its naval assets and used a term, the Fourth Fleet, in their reorganization. Now, I'm not going to criticize my colleagues too much in WHA, because who knew? the front office cleared, the country officers cleared, but it was Peter Sampson, the doctorate, who recognized the history of US Navy perceptions of the US naval history in the hemisphere. And this Fourth Fleet was going to be problematic. And sure enough, Hugo Chavez and others grabbed onto it. What's the United States doing? It's reinvigorating gunboat diplomacy. But it wasn't just those two. It was our partners, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia. Others were curious, what are we doing at this time? I also found in my research a memo during the Bay of Pigs by the one historian who worked in JFK's office, Arthur Schlesinger. He wrote a long memo opposing the Bay of Pigs because he accurately predicted what the reaction would be in Latin America to an invasion of Cuba. And what he didn't predict was that we would fail. He said even his whole concept, his whole idea was we're going to succeed, but at what price? And again, it was his understanding of history. It was a memo that obviously JFK did not attune to. And so finally, just a couple of thoughts on how do we improve our historic literacy and awareness. And Dan already referred to the need for more training. I mean, I think I counted in my entire, I'm not the norm here, but I had 8 months of training total, including junior officer training in my 26-year career, including 2 weeks of area studies for the Sub-Saharan Africa and for Latin America separately at 2 different times. That is really not adequate. You know, I have a lot of respect for, and we can talk about this later, for the people who run the area studies, but they're limited as well. And I have to imagine that, what if I had had the chance to get a master's degree in history at UMass before I retired? I have a friend who at DOD who got her master's degree at the Kennedy School. I don't propose that everybody get a master's degree at government expense, but surely 4 weeks of area studies is insufficient. We do have an office of the historian in the department. I think it's underutilized. I knew it was there, but I never really even knew about it. They attended our meetings irregularly in WHA while I was there. The one person who did use them, the PhD in our office. And finally, I would propose, we had a wonderful Jefferson Fellow in our office in WHA. This is a scientist from who come to the department and spend a year their sabbatical at their university, and they spend it at the State Department. We also have Franklin Fellows, business leaders who come. Why don't we have a program to invite historians to spend a year in the department? Anyway, so I think I've gone on enough. Let me stop here, and I'm hoping that I was able to stimulate some discussion, but also perhaps any corrections. I'm also looking forward to hearing. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, John. Hi, everyone. So for our next segment of the program, we'll go on to Q&A. Please feel free. I see that we have one question to start us off with in the Q&A from our colleague, Mike McCary. But please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. It is the icon that has 2 speech bubbles. Please feel free to type your questions in there, and we'll be able to bring them up to John. So John, I will start off with the question from Mike McCary. He says, John, I just started reading your book, but it already has reminded me how inadequate I found my FSI area studies course. Those are old data points, though, and I wonder if you have a sense of how well FSI does now. If things are still not what they should be, how might we try to change that?
So just, and perhaps, thanks, Mike, and nice to hear your question and who it's coming from. I remember Mike from his support for the exchanges for many years in Washington. I think I would agree with Mike about the 2 weeks area studies. I really admire, I can remember the man, the academic who organized the Sub-Saharan, John Collier. He did the best he could. He brought in outside speakers, but he's doing 2 weeks, an entire subcontinent of 50 countries, and he has to do economics, political relations with the United States, and the time devoted to history, even for the countries that I went to, Nigeria and South Africa, big countries in the hemisphere, was just minimal at best. I enjoyed it a lot. I knew a lot about Africa before going over. I supplemented with myself. And then, as the Foreign Service does, I was told, well, you got to get another geographic area under your belt. And so I was moved to Latin America, again, spent 2 weeks in the 90s at an area studies course. And it was, once again, insufficient, totally unable to capture what needed to be captured for Foreign Service officers going overseas in that 2 week period. The other thing that happened that I realized afterwards was much of the material about our behavior around the hemisphere was still classified and confidential. And even though we all had our security clearances, there were people from other agencies who did not, and we never got into those areas of that. For example, the coups support in Guatemala and other countries, that was all classified, so we didn't know it. Now I understand that FSI has, in some ways, and I see Steve Chaplin's on the line here as well, that they have supplemented some of their broader area studies with in-depth study of individual countries, but and that they do include now that the information has been declassified, they do include more of examples of our behavior around the country, around the continent. But I'll let others comment on that who have more direct. But I do think 8 months of training over 26 careers just is not enough. I was partly to blame for that. I saw training as a way to off the track of a career path, and I was eager to get moving and get on. But I think more can be done, certainly.
Great, thank you so much, John. I'll move to our next question from Dan Saribny. He asks, what can PAOs and senior public diplomacy leaders in Washington do to foster such understanding of critical historical events, facts, or memories within their teams, missions, or bureaus, and within the always busy realities of our work?
You're right, and there is a competition for this all the time. I almost think, this Harvard political scientist who wrote the book Thinking in Time, they had a program at Harvard for many years where they would invite decision makers up and they would do case studies with them, and they would interject this pause to look for and try to identify analogies that might be appropriate. When you write a memo or you see a memo, to clear off on a memo, that whether it's an action, I don't know if they still do action memos and information memos, they always start with a little background. And perhaps that's a role, that's an area where as decisions on these are done on a memo basis in Washington, to expand on this background and they include in those possible historical analogies that might be appropriate. As technical and as that, I do think utilizing the office of the historian would be a better way. I was, again, fortunate to have a PhD in history in the office who would rein this in and constantly refer to history in the discussions that we had and arm me with information as I talked. So that's where the idea of having PhDs outside government coming in and working for a year on their sabbaticals, I think would be helpful as well. The Office of the Historian used to write very short 3-page memos on current events, giving a little bit of a historic background. As far as I know, those were totally ignored, unfortunately. And so I think maybe there might be something to strengthen that function as well.
Well, speaking of that, we just got a question in from Nick Call, who asks,
Uh-oh.
as a historian, it is a little sad to realize the 60-year-old revisionist discourse on US foreign policy has made so little impact. What can historians do on their supply side of the equation to increase the impact of their work?
Very good question. I would say increase the lines of connection, communication with those who are on the front lines as well. And for example, what can a professional historian do right now to talk about Vladimir Putin's use of Jim Baker's statement of not 1 inch that he has taken out of context in terms of NATO enlargement? Jim Baker had made an offer, and it was never a formal proposal for the reunification of Germany. And he said, and he clarified, we're talking about East Germany being part of NATO, not any other countries. And Gorbachev has subsequently agreed with that interpretation of that comment. But a woman just wrote a book, a historian wrote a book called Not 1 Inch about this whole event. But this is something Putin is using right now. And I think it should be more public. How do you get this information out more broadly? Now, of course, we know in this country, just having the right and accurate competing interpretation is not enough to convince anybody. But I think the idea of getting the word out there so that the only people who control the narrative isn't Vladimir Putin, that there is an alternative interpretation of the history of this current crisis right now.
And along those lines, I'd love to bring forward a question from Denise Kirkpatrick, who's a senior advisor with the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. She mentions, in your presentation, you mentioned the history of Cold War civil rights and how the US government treated the race relations question in our foreign policy. Given the events in the last 2 years on racial reckoning, what do you feel are the lessons learned that we can apply from history to the work of public diplomacy in addressing domestic issues that overlap with foreign policy goals?
A wonderful question. Anybody who thinks that our soft power as a nation has declined should look at the number of movements around the world with using signs of this slogan, Black Lives Matter. I think that this was something that was picked up in Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, all over the world, I think. And so just to see this, the importance of the dialogue and discussion that we were having and continue to have is significant. I did say, as Malcolm X predicted I would in Nigeria, that we've made progress on civil rights 20 years after he said it. But I also, as many of you, I'm sure, talked about the imperfection of our society, that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence talk about towards a more perfect union. We're not perfect, but we are working towards. I think it still holds true. I think it still is a case study of how the United States could and should deal with issues that come in, and the issue of race relations. I cite in the book a question from a student in Mexico after 9/11. He said, I think it's time for the United States to start looking at itself a little. And my answer was, welcome to the land of introspection. I mean, this is what we do in self-reflection. It doesn't take much. I think we're in a particularly troubling time, and I don't know, other people would agree, where the basic facts about what we're discussing are really up for, are competing now, or that we're dealing from a very different set of facts in these discussions, in the dialogue we're having, and they're not always true. But anyway, that's getting a little off subject. But I do think we still are a model to the rest of the world. And as we have issues of within race relations in the United States, it actually inspires other people in other countries who also have their own issues of being overlooked, neglected, and discriminated against.
And we certainly have a few questions that came in asking about, culturally, is the US simply outside the norm internationally, in the sense that we don't value history in the way others do? And another question on whether or not there is a way to teach history in a balanced way when there is an agreement about the definition of balanced. So I think this definitely is something that needs quite a lot more thought. But I do want to go back to what you had mentioned before about training, as we have a few questions that came in, and one from Bruce Gregory says, is more training sufficient? Ambassador Ron Newman and several recent reports on foreign service reform make a strong case for mid-career professional education in addition to training, similar to what has been long standard in the military. Funding, of course, is an issue, but perhaps it's also a question of mindsets. Do you have views on how the FS thinks about professional education?
Well, I would say great to hear from you, Bruce. You've done so much over the years and to support and promote public diplomacy in a serious way. I think on training, I mentioned already, I don't think it's sufficient. I remember having the privilege of joining Ambassador Dennis Jett, who at Meridian House had his one-day pre-departure seminar on Peru. And they brought in a series of people, academics from around the country, to just talk for one day with him. Wasn't one-on-one, it was 13-on-1. And Ambassador Jett was there with his wife, and I was the only other Foreign Service officer in the room. And he had invited, why was I the only other Foreign Service officer in the room? This was all information that was important and would have been interesting to anybody. And we have the technology to make it available if it's only one ambassador who can. And why can't other people get access? And again, it's only just one day. Now, professional education, as a Foreign Service officer, and I'm sorry to say this to the academics like Nick Cole who are on the line, was I often saw the disconnect between the practice, the policy, and the research as a Foreign Service officer. And I don't know whether I looked askance, perhaps, at what academics were saying about the same country that I was operating in, but perhaps that's the best way that to put it. But I think I was also in my own biases. I having had this university experience after retirement, it opened my eyes to the value of professional academics and the research they were doing. And so I think giving something like that again, I go back to what I said in the talk, wouldn't it have been great if I had had that kind of opportunity while I was a Foreign Service officer to gain respect for these people who had had been doing research and were extremely knowledgeable in ways that I never saw when I was an officer. I don't know if that answers it, but.
Well, I think it's definitely food for thought. Now, I think we have time for just about one more question, and I would like to ask one that Sherry Mueller posted, as it is something that I, as an aspiring Foreign Service officer, am also very curious about. John, do you have a favorite bibliography for new Foreign Service officers or those who are aspiring to gain more of the history? I, for one, will definitely be picking up your book, but what other books or resources would you recommend to really gain a better history and appreciation for the great work that's been done before?
So that's a great question. Dan had mentioned at the end of each chapter there, I had put in a little bibliography. That was at the request of the publisher, who said, instead of a bibliography, why don't you just put in an annotated what books you recommend for people who want to dig deeper. There were two books that were some of the last books I read, and I wish I had read them first off. One of them I already mentioned was this book called Thinking in Time, Uses of History for Decision-Making. The other was I think the University of Texas academics had pulled together a book called The Power of the Past, History and Statecraft of the Past. Hal Brands and Jerome Suri were the editors, but they included wonderful chapters, one written by a former policy planning person in the I think the first Obama administration or first Obama term. His name escapes me at the time. Those were two books that I would recommend. Again, I would refer to the other ones because the chapters in the book are really have to do with country by country specific chapters. So.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, John. Do you have any concluding thoughts? Otherwise, I will hand it right over to Joel Fishman.
No, I would only say thank you very much. I've done a number of these. These were the hardest questions to answer. And obviously from very thoughtful people, and nice to see your names. It would be great to see you all in person at one point along the way. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your questions. And now I'll turn it over to Joel to conclude the event.
Well, thank you. And thank you, John. You've given us a lot to think about and think we will. And we'll be back in touch with you. I'm Joel Fishman, president of the Public Diplomacy Association of America. And it's my job to give you a preview of what's coming up. On February 7, Alan Goodman, CEO of the International Institute of Education, will discuss IIE's new research on international students studying in the US. The 100 years of data from IIE's International Student Mobility Census and Open Door surveys gives us a good basis to forecast what's ahead in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Goodman will go behind the headlines from the latest data and discuss what it portends for international education at US colleges and universities and America's public diplomacy. IIE, as we know, is one of the US's major international exchange organizations, and many of us have had the privilege of working very closely with IIE. Well, all of us in the Public Diplomacy Association of America, the Public Diplomacy Council, and USC Annenberg Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy wish all of you a very happy and healthy new year. We shall see you on February 7. Bye for now.